Hey everybody, how's it going? So today we're going to learn about object methods and a little bit about classes today in Python, and then we're going to talk about errors and debugging. So that's what we're going to talk about. It's a lot of stuff, but we're going to cover it very briefly. And if you have any questions, just feel free to ask me, and I'll try to get back to you on specific answers. So um, let's talk about, let's see, where should we start? I think we should start with object methods. So variables in Python can have their own class. For example, let's look at this top variable up here, word, right? Word is a string, and this specifically the name of this variable is example string object. Now, if we go ahead and print the type of this string, and just for good measure, let's go ahead and print the string. So if we go ahead and print this string, we can see that it's word. And then if we print the type of the string, or the type of variable that it is, what's this object? What type is this object? It is in the string class. Okay, well, what does that tell us? Well, so the thing about classes in Python is that any specific class in Python will have its own methods and attributes. For example, for my gamers out there, you can think of class attributes kind of like for example, a class in a role-playing game, for example. So like you have like fighter and wizard and all this stuff like in medieval kind of role-play games, and each class will have its own sort of attributes. Like obviously every class will have its own health points and mana points, maybe, or magic points or something, and stamina points maybe, and all those stats will be different, but they all have those same attributes. Whether the stats themselves are different doesn't matter in this context. Excuse me. All that matters is that the actual attributes are those attributes. They have those attributes. There's never a point where they don't have those attributes. Or if they do, if they, for example, maybe they have no magic points. Maybe if it's like a barbarian class or something, maybe they have no magic points at all in whatever RPG you're in. But that doesn't mean that they don't have that attribute. It just means that those points are zero. Does that make sense? So they still have those attributes, right? And that's what you can think of when you think of a class. So, for example, if this was its own class, like let's pretend that this variable here was a class, or sorry, not the literal string, but the actual variable. If this was its own class and it had its own attribute, I could, for example, go like here, I could put a dot and I could say dot HP. Like let's pretend for a moment that this is like a fighter class in a game. I could print that and that would print me the attribute of the variable. Now, I don't need you to know a lot about attributes because it's not super relevant for what we're going to talk about today, but just know that that is a thing for classes. In this case, it doesn't apply to what we're talking about. The next thing that we're going to talk about, though, that does apply is methods. So it's a function, kind of like this print function down here, but it's a function that's tied specifically to the object class. So when I go in Python here and I type, for example string object equals word with the quotes, what I'm actually doing behind the scenes in Python is, sorry, hang on guys, I'm gonna make it so that this isn't so stretched because it's looking really strange. So we're just gonna deal with that for now. That'll be what it's just temporarily. And let me, well, you can't really see the output if I do it that way. I'll just have to make it a little smaller for the time being, just for now, and then we'll kind of deal with this in a second. It's just driving me nuts. Sorry, guys. Okay, so yeah, so whenever I initialize this variable by giving it a value and saying it's assigned to something, what I'm actually doing, what Python is actually doing, is it's creating an instance of a string class object. Now, because Python has these string objects already built into the code, there are helpful functions that we can do to strings to modify them to create new strings. And that's what we call methods. A function that is tied to a class is a method. Now, for example, let me show you. You might have noticed when I pressed the dot here, things showed up whenever I was pressing that. So let's go ahead and run this, and let's look here. So if I press the dot, you can see there are all these functions that come up, and these are methods tied to the class. And you'll know that they're functions because you have to pass something into them, like you have to call them with parentheses. So for example, title doesn't take any arguments, so you're not passing anything into these parentheses, but you still have to use the parentheses because you're calling a function. In this case, you're calling a method that's tied to the object. Now, to make this a little more clear, let's go ahead and show you. Well, I'll go ahead and show you what this does. So let me just print the string now, and you'll notice that it is, hang on. So let me just attach this to, just to save us some time so I don't have to rewrite this whole variable or whatever. So now if I print this out, it should give me the capital W word. And that's what the title method does. So you need to know what these methods are because that's how you modify your data. Because if you think about it, programming is really just taking some data and modifying it or deleting it or creating new data or recording like new data or whatever. But you're just taking values and you're just changing bits around. That's all you're really doing in programming. You're just flipping bits and you know, resetting them and all that. That's all you're really doing on the hardware scale, just with a lot more like logic behind the scenes. So that's what you're doing in Python is like, if you say .title, what it's going to do is it's going to read the word and it's just going to take the first letter and change it to upper and then the rest of the word, and it's going to keep the rest of it lowercase. And that's all it did right there. And again, this .title thing is a method here. Now, if you want to know, like, for example, we were in PyCharm and we were able to see all the methods when we did the dot. Like, I can do this and I can say dot, and then we can see all the methods here, which is really helpful. But what if you don't have this? What if this doesn't pop up for you? Well, there is actually a command that you can run. In fact, there's two really helpful commands that you can run to figure this out. So let's go ahead and uncomment these lines. So the directory command, if you use this directory function here, you can put the directory and then you can pass in whatever object you want. Now, because this is just a normal variable, it's not like a special class I made, it will actually just print whatever the normal variable type's directory is. In this case, it's a string, so it's going to print me, oh, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong thing. This is just going to print me the actual directory of what it looks like. So I'll go ahead and comment out help for a moment so I can show you. So if I run this now, you can see it's going to show me everything that it showed me when I pressed the dot before. And this is a way to see this like in the console if you only have access to the console, or if you're doing like shell programming or something like in the moment and you need this in a pinch, this is a way to see this. Now what I want you to notice here though is every method, so these are the names of the methods, the ones that don't have these dunder double underscore statements, dunder for short. The ones that don't have those, these are the methods. So this is the name of the methods. And so what I want you to notice though is that these are case sensitive. So for example, if I go here and I go to print, I can't print like, I can't say title. Notice like Python's yelling at me. It doesn't understand like, what does this mean? It's unresolved. String.title. What the heck is this? But if I go here and I replace that, it works. And you'll notice if we scroll over, which you might have to scroll for a little bit to get there. If we scroll over, here it is, title. It's case sensitive. So when you're calling these functions, these methods, you have to call them in their correct case. I know that sounds obvious, but it is very particular about that. Now, that's the directory command. This is somewhat useful, but all it's telling us is the names of the methods. It's not really telling us like what they do. So sure, this is nice to know if you already know what you're looking for. Maybe you just forgot the name of whatever it is, but you know what it does. So that could be helpful. Like maybe if that doesn't show up for you, like when you click here or whatever. But let's see if we can get the description. So if we use the help function here and pass in just a normal string object, we can't pass in the example object. We have to just pass in what variable type it is. In this case, it's a string. So if we use the help function here and then we just print that out, it's going to print a lot more stuff. But this is the actual documentation of these methods and of the class itself from the coders of Python. Like this is actually coded into Python itself. And for example, if you built your own class here and you typed help, it would show you all the documentation that you made for your own class here. So that's what the help function does. Very, very helpful when working with data types and variables to know like what the heck are my like methods that I can use for this class, or like what can I do to this variable? Like, okay, I have the word here in the string. What can I do to this? And what do these functions do? Or maybe you're trying to use the title function, but you don't really understand what it does. Or like, for example, if you have a list and you're trying to figure out what's the difference between append and extend, they seem like the same thing. Well, I mean, of course, you can always like look it up on the internet, but if you want to look at the actual documentation in a quick, easy way inside of your own coding environment, well, here you go, look at it. And this works for anything. Like, you can pass in other things. Like if you're importing, for example, NumPy or pandas or requests library or something, you can pass this help function into any kind of object. For example, when you import requests, so let's say I was coding for a second. If I was importing the requests library and I did requests.get, this is great, but I could just pass in, for example, I could say help.requests, and it's going to print out a bunch of stuff because I have all this other stuff down here. So we're just going to comment that out for a minute. I could just print that, and let me not do this because it's going to yell at me because I don't have any arguments in that. But I could do that, and then I can get the information from their library about the requests. Like, okay, this is, whoops, I clicked on a link. My bad. Luckily, it was just Python. It wasn't like malware or something. But anyway, this is their description of what the like requests class is, and this is the get usage. This is the post usage. This is like how you would post to something, and these are all the like contents of the library. And I think this is specifically is passing in the help of the actual thing. But you can imagine if there was like a specific class inside of requests, it would be really great. I mean, you could, well, for example, we could say from requests, import requests. And then I think that would work because I think that's what we're actually looking for. Yeah, so right here, import request, and then this is like the method, and this is the URL, and this is how you would find this stuff. Now, I don't want you to get too caught up in reading the documentation of everything because some of it will go over your head, especially if you're first learning programming. I don't want you to feel like you have to memorize all this documentation. Only look it up when you need it. And even if you're reading this and you're in a pinch and you're just like so stressed out and you can't figure out what the heck it's talking about, feel free to go online and look up stuff about it. Watch a YouTube tutorial about people using it, whatever. But don't feel like you have to conquer all this knowledge all at once. That's a little silly. Okay, with that out of the way, those are methods. Now, one big caveat to methods that I really want to point out is it's really, really easy to accidentally like use a method that doesn't belong to what you're doing. So, for example, this is a string, but what if I wanted to like append something to the string? Like, let's say I heard someone talking about append, and I was like, okay, I want to add an exclamation point to the end of this string, right? Because maybe I don't know that you can just concatenate it with like this, Maybe I want to add in an exclamation point. Well, watch what happens. So if I try to do this, Python's going to yell at me, and it says the string object has no attribute append. So this is where we get into the errors and debugging side of our lecture today, and this is the part that I really want to stress because I can give you a list of all the methods. In fact, I showed you how to look at all of them and look at all their documentation and figure out what they do. In fact, real quick, let me go ahead and print that one more time because I want to show you the help function. So let's look up here title, for example. This is what we were looking at before when we ran the title function. It says return a version of the string where each word is title cased, which it kind of references itself in the definition. So maybe you don't know what title case means, but that's more of an English thing, I guess. It says more specifically, words will start with an uppercase character and all remaining cases will be lowercase. So in this case, luckily, they did define what title case means, which I know this is like obvious English stuff, but it is helpful for people who don't speak English as their first language or something. So this is a good example of when you would want to do this. And in fact, looking at the documentation, I didn't even know you could translate things in strings. I didn't know that was a thing. And this is why it's good to look at the documentation. Maybe there's a thing that you don't know about that you could do. And this is why it's really cool to look at this stuff sometimes. But you don't have to memorize all this. I just thought it was cool. And I wanted to share this with you as a really helpful tip when you're trying to debug your code. Now, anyway, let's go ahead and move on here. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to get rid of some of these because I want to move on to the next topic. And I hope you guys could see what I was talking about when I did that. Yeah, you could see the title. Okay, sorry. I forgot I moved things on OBS. Whoops, sorry guys. Okay, so yeah, okay. So let's go ahead and talk about like errors, common errors that you might get when you're coding. That's the next part of our lecture today. So let's go ahead and talk about that. So some common sources of errors you will get when you're first starting out is like obvious syntax errors. Like, for example, if I forget a colon here, it's going to yell at me. Okay, it's going to say invalid syntax. Syntax errors are going to be your biggest part because you need to know how the heck to write your code. Okay, first of all. But now let's talk about some obvious errors other than that. So there's some errors like, for example, if you pass in something that, like, for example, this function here, this print function, which I kind of named poorly because, there's the print function and then there's the print function. But it's the print function. But anyway, in my print function squared, as we'll call it, you pass in a parameter and then it'll print that to the console. So there's going to be some other stuff that prints as well if you run these other functions and do whatever. But in this case, we didn't actually print the value. We just returned it. So I'm going to go ahead and print that too. I just realized, which is another common mistake people would make. So that's a good point to show. But anyway, so hello world. So what it does is it'll print whatever you pass into the function. In this case, I'm passing this into the function. So it says, okay, this is what people are going to pass in. This is what we're going to do to that. We're going to print it. So we're going to pass in this into whatever the function. So this is the name of the function. This is what we're passing into the function. This is our input. And we're going to print to the console whatever they passed into the function. That's what this function does. And so right here, as you can see, I said print hello world. But what if I didn't make this function? What if I'm trying to do some function like, for example, an object method, like the word thing, where I was like, I changed the title case? What if I was trying to pass something into that, for example? So let's take this function, for example. Let's just pretend, for example, that I didn't make this. Let's pretend I'm using some built-in function into Python. What if I try to do this? What if I say hello world and hi to the viewers? I don't know. That's a bad thing, but whatever. It works. So obviously you can tell if you look closely, it's highlighted. PyCharm is already yelling at me. In fact, this is a really good thing. If you look closely, it's going to say like, PyCharm is yelling at me, but you may not understand why it's yelling at you when you're writing the code. You may just be like, oh, it's just highlighted. I might have, maybe I didn't capitalize this or something. But no, PyCharm is smart enough to know that I'm an idiot here because it only takes one parameter. But let's go ahead and run this. So look, you're gonna get errors like this all the time when you first start programming. You're gonna say this takes X amount of arguments, but you gave Y amount of arguments, or maybe it takes 0 arguments. So for example, I could rename this function. So I'm gonna go ahead and fix this error here, and then I'm gonna make a new function real quick, and we're gonna call it def print function 2, and then we're not gonna give it any arguments, and we're just gonna say print hello world 2. All right, just so it's a little clearer what it's doing. So now if I print this, then, oh, I never called it. Whoops, silly me. My bad. That's another thing, making your functions but not actually calling them. Duh. Good examples today. I'm just all over today, I swear, guys, the holidays are messing me up. Okay, so hello world, that was our first function. So this part makes up this part of our output here. This is where we printed the next one. So as you can see, this doesn't take any arguments. But what if I did that? What if I confused the syntax? What if maybe I thought that this one was the one that took the arguments? What if I go ahead and say that? Watch what happens. It's going to yell at me. It takes 0 positional arguments, but 1 was given. That means what that's saying to you, and hopefully it's clear enough for you to understand, is that this doesn't take any arguments. I don't need to put anything in here. I just call it and it works. It's the function. It does what it's supposed to do. Because, look, it only has one line of code. Print hello world 2. That's all it does. If I call this function, it just executes that line for me. Maybe you put 50 lines under here, but it still doesn't require any input. You just call the function and then it does the script. It does all the 50 things you want it to do. Functions don't need to have inputs for them to be functions. They can not have inputs. They can take 1,000,000 inputs. In fact, the print function could take I think there is a hard limit on how many things you could put in the print function. I think it's like over 1,000 things or something. It's a really high number, but it's basically infinite for most people because you'll never actually use that many things that you're passing into it at once. But that is what I'm trying to say is the print function can take a crap ton of arguments. This function takes 0. They're both perfectly valid functions, in which case this function is kind of useless because I could just write this line of code. I don't have to define a whole function for it. But just because a function does not take any arguments does not mean that it's not useful. Anyway, that's a lot of talking so far, but the point that I'm making is that that's a common error that you're going to run into. And so you need to know what you're passing into your functions. You need to know what they expect. If you don't understand how to use a function, like for example, these are functions I made, so I kind of know how they're used. This is a pretty obvious function. But like, for example, the print function, like the actual print function, maybe I don't know how it works. Like, the print function is actually a pretty easy function to use, so that's not really the best example. But for example, let's go down here for a minute and let's go ahead and just comment these lines of code out. So let's say I have this list here that I made. So what if I just say test list dot append, right? But I don't append anything into it, right? So I'm just going to say print test list. And it's never going to execute this code because it's going to give me an error saying, hey, you didn't put anything in here. For example, it takes exactly one argument. I was supposed to pass something in here. This is a list as well. I don't know. Like, see, this would work. So now it just added that onto my list, but I didn't pass anything into this method here. And that's why it's giving me an error. Another error, obviously, is you might get this error. This is a good example to show you. Unexpected EOF while parsing. This is because, hey, look at this. I didn't put a closing parentheses. So Python is like going all the way from here to the end of the file and saying, hey, I checked the whole file and I don't see where you added the closing parentheses. Like, what if I put it here? It's not going to give me that error anymore, but it will yell at me about this other stuff because I'm trying to pass none in here. So that's, annoying. But that's what I'm saying is like, Python's going to yell at me because I didn't end the parentheses. These are errors that you guys are going to get, and I'm telling you, some of these errors are going to be really hard to troubleshoot, especially when you're first starting out. I know these seem kind of obvious and simple when you're watching me do this, but when you're like 400 lines deep in some crazy monolithic script that you're writing for your class project or something, it's not easy to figure out where these errors are coming from. Even if Python tells you exactly what line they're coming from, like, maybe I don't know. Like, and so, for example, like, you can imagine this would be a big source of error, especially when you're like super deep in coding. So here's where I'm going to show you something that's really powerful, that's really going to help you. So let's just clear all this stuff out. And if you want to get this stuff, just, come back to the video. I will leave this stuff up here because it is extremely important. This stuff isn't quite as important, so I'm going to, get rid of most of this stuff. But let's take a look here. So why is it yelling at me about this line? Replace list creation? Oh, I think it was the append thing or something. Okay, so yeah. So let's say I want to iterate through this list. Okay. Now ideally you would do this in a function or something, but I'm just going to show you just in the global namespace. But let's say we're going to say for each word in the test list, I want to convert it to uppercase. So we're going to say word.upper, and we're not going to actually change those words. We're just going to print that. That's all we're going to do. And then we're going to print the normal list above this so that we can see what it's doing. Now, this will be pretty obvious because, as you can see, this was the original list. This is it going through each line and doing this. So let me show you what debugging does. So let's look at debugging. So this is a powerful tool that I wanted to show you guys. So if you go here and you see these breakpoints I just added, this is how you add them. You go to each line, click the little dots, like to create a dot, and you'll notice that the line is now highlighted. I don't actually have to highlight this line or this line. It's really these two lines that I need to highlight. So we can go ahead and unhighlight those. But I just wanted to show you that's how you do it. So now with these two lines highlighted, what you can do is you can go over here to this little bug looking icon. If you can't really see that, you can also find it up here when you right click and click debug. Now, of course, it doesn't show for you for some reason. Hang on. Let me see if I can change that. It's not capturing on OBS for some reason. So anyway, you would right click up here and there's a thing that says debug if you're in PyCharm. But if you can't see that, there is this little bug icon up here. So we'll show you that. So what's going to happen is your code is going to run all the way up until it gets to the first breakpoint, and that's what these are called, these little lines that are highlighted in red when you add the dots. So your code is going to run when it gets to the first breakpoint, and then it's going to stop. and then there's going to be this little like pause play looking icon. It says resume program, or you can just press F9 on your keyboard if you're on Windows or whatever. But before you do that, I want you to take a close look, because you can actually see right here, it'll tell you what the variable is. Now in this case, it's obvious. We know what the variable is because it doesn't really change right now. Like, we're not changing anything about the variable. So it's pretty obvious what the variable does. But for example, if this was a list that changed in every iteration of this loop, we would want to know what that variable value is on each iteration. So that's a good example of when to see that. And the other thing I want to point out here, though, is that notice each. So let's just like put a mental block here and pretend this doesn't exist. Just look at the debug here. So what I want you to notice is each item in this list has a quote around it, like surrounding it. And that means it's a string. And you can actually see this if you click this little drop down here. Now, it might be kind of hard to see, but there's a little drop down arrow here. You can click that, or you can find it here. It's the same place. This is another way to see it, whichever one works better for you. But you can click the little drop down, and you can actually see it will tell you the index. So the first item in the list, the index starts at 0, as a reminder. The first item in the list is this, and you can see it says it's a string variable. It's a string type object, okay? It also shows you the length of the list, which you can access through those functions, but we'll just ignore that for right now. Let's just pretend that doesn't exist for the minute. But you can see it shows the index, so this is the first item in the list, this is the second item, third item, fourth item, and this is what the value is, and it says this is what the type of variable is. I want you guys to really, like, if you don't remember anything ever from any of these videos, I really want you to remember this. This is extremely important, okay? Please pay attention. This is the value of your variables, okay? This is where it shows you the value of your variables, this section right here in PyCharm, this, like, section right here, and over here as well. And it's really important to know what are the values of my variables and what type are they. That's extremely important. You could be trying to add a string to an integer, because let's say, for example, let's just ignore this whole thing. I'll show you debugging in 1 second, because we'll come back to this. But let's say, for example, I have an input variable, and let's just say, for example, input, please give me a number, right? And then I can say if input variable is digit, then print, wait, no. Then, yeah, print 1 plus input variable, right? Now, this is going to give me an error because you can't add a string to an integer. Now, let me show you this. It's going to print the other stuff up here too, because I didn't do that, but oh, I guess I should have given a space, but we'll ignore that for now. So let's say I want to add 5. So you would think that if I put 5 in here, and then when I put a 1 here, it's going to give me 6. It's going to print 6, right? Nope, that's not what's going to happen. It's going to give me an error because it's going to say, hey, you're trying to add a string of quote-unquote 5 plus the integer 1. And you're going to get errors like this all the time when you're first starting out. So one easy way to do this is you can just convert this to an integer if it's a digit. But we don't want to do that unless it is a digit, because then it'll give us an error. Because if I put like a Q in here and it tries to convert that to an integer, then it's going to give me an error. So after you confirm that what they typed is a digit, which by the way, this is another string method that we can go over, but I just want to, we'll just show this for the sake of time. But if we know that it is a digit, then I have no problems converting this into an integer. And then if I do that, watch what happens. I give a number, let's give 5, and then boom, it gives me 6 and it stops the code. That's what I want you guys to know, is like when you're debugging your code, you need to know what value are my integer, or what value are my variables and what type of variables are they. This was a string. From this line, this creates a string variable. Whatever, it doesn't matter. Whatever I input in here, it doesn't matter if it's a number or not. This will be a string of that number. It could be a symbol, it could be a letter, it could be a number. It doesn't matter what the heck I put in this code, like in that input up here. It's going to give me a string. So I need to check if what I typed was a number. And then if it is, I need to convert it to an actual number type of variable in Python, okay? This is how you deal with those things. Now, let's go back to debugging. I just wanted to show you that. But let's go back to debugging here. So if I debug this, let's look at this. Watch closely. I'm going to go ahead and execute this line of code. So now look, it says the word. So remember, this represents each item that you're iterating through. So we're traversing the list by element here. So for each word in the list, and this can be anything, you can put anything in this. I could say for element, I could say for string, I could say whatever. But I just said this so it looks more readable to you guys. But for a word in the test list, which is what we're iterating through, what is our value? So our current value of the word is this, and it's a string, okay? Now I can tell it's a string by the quotes. I don't have to open this up or look at it here and see that it says that it's a string right here. Now I did want you to see that it says it here and here. And notice that, I'm going to go ahead and stop this so I can show you. Notice that when I executed that line, it didn't show the word variable until it executes that line of code. And now look, boom, now it shows it. So anyway, so now that we know what the variable value is, what am I doing to that variable? So we're passing in word here, and we're converting it to an upper, and then we're printing out what that value is. So I'm going to go ahead and go like that. And now you didn't see anything happen, but if I go over to the console, you can see it went ahead and processed that, and it did go ahead and convert it to an upper, and it printed it out just like we wanted. And now if I do that again, look, I'm going to execute the next line of code. So we're currently on the green line here. So if I go ahead and execute that line, it says, okay, the word is now is. So let's go ahead and convert is to uppercase, and then let's go ahead and print that out. So if I do that, boom, there it is. And it's going to do that again for A, and it's going to say, okay, the word is now A. Let's go ahead and convert that and print that. Boom, there it is. And now if I can run this next line, okay, this is a list, so this string is list, and it's a string, okay, and then we're going to print that and convert that, right? And now, boom, right? But what if I did this? What if I said word plus 10, right? Well, it's going to give me an error. It's not even going to actually execute the first line even, because as soon as it says, okay, word equals this, and then this plus 10, well, that's not a thing, right? So we can't do that. So it'll even tell you where the line of code is, where I went wrong. But, like line 21 here, right? But, when you're starting out, this may not make sense to you. So this is why it's important to know how to debug your code and know what you're doing. And I know this sounds like kind of like obvious stuff, like, yeah, just I want to go ahead and code. But I'm telling you, it'll save you literally hours of time. Like, I guess if you like sitting around and wasting your time trying to post your questions on Stack Overflow and have a bunch of neckbeards yell at you because you're an idiot because you don't know how to debug your code, sure. I'm not saying you are an idiot just because you don't know this stuff. I'm just saying if you want to get treated like one by a bunch of neckbeards on Stack Overflow who are tired of people asking dumb questions, well, here you go. This is how you avoid that. This is how you check what your variable values are and what you're doing to those variables. And if you're like, maybe print only takes one argument, maybe I'm passing too many arguments in here, so it's going to tell me an error or something. There's also a common error I will see where people will try to access indexes that are out of range. So for example, let's just get rid of this for loop here. And let's say I wanted to print the test list. I don't even need to do this because I have this line of code up here. But let's just say I want to print the 5th item in this test list. In this case, the 6, because 0 starts at 0, or the index starts at 0. So this is the first item. This is index 0. This is index 1. This is the second item. This is index 2. This is the third item. This is index 3, which is the 4th item. So index 5 doesn't exist. So if I try to print this, it's going to say index is out of range. List index out of range, right? This is what I mean. Like, these are common errors. Like, okay, if I were to debug my code, like, let's say I don't know what the value of my variable is. Like, let's say I added something to this list. In fact, let's just say for I in range 10, and let's create a new list, empty, well, actually, let's just call it container list of numbers, right? And let's go ahead and make it an empty list. And let's just get rid of this line here so it's not going to throw us an error. So let's say for I in range, append, container list dot append I, right? So what's going to happen is when we run this line of code, it's going to append that list and it's going to add that to each item. Now, I can show you the finished product of this, but I want you to see it in real time, well, in slow-mo time, so to speak, what it's actually doing. So let's go ahead and run this. So you can see it adds from 1 through 9. Now, I guess let's just make it a little bit more obvious, like let's say 1 to 11, so it looks like more clear to what we would think it would be, as humans, because we start counting at 1 and all that. So it's basically saying I'm going to take I, which is at 1. We start at 1, and we're just going to we're going to append I to the list. So what we're doing is we're going to add 1 to the list, and we're going to add 2 to the list, and we're going to add 3 to the list. But I want you to see this. Let's pretend like this isn't an obvious line of code. Let's pretend there's a bunch of complicated stuff happening here. And then by the end of this crazy complicated code, we're adding something to the list, okay? Let's see what that would look like when you're debugging this. So we can ignore the test list here, but just forget it exists for a minute. But anyway, so let's go ahead and go here. So, and matter of fact, I'm just going to comment this out so it doesn't interfere with what I'm trying to show you. So it's not like information overload here. Okay, so we're going to start here. So look, container list is equal to empty list. That makes sense. We haven't done anything yet. Okay, so I is currently 1. We just executed this line. It says our I value here is currently 1 because we're going from range 1 to 10. So for I in range 1 to 10 means I starts at 1 and it ends at 11 technically, but it's going to do stuff at 10 and then it's going to stop when it gets to 11. So our I is currently 1. So if I look here and I say append I, what I'm saying is I'm going to append 1 to the list. So this is our list that we're adding stuff. And by the way, if you don't know what append means we're going to add something to the end of the list, by the way. I don't know if that was clear or not, but yeah. So to the end of the list, so what we're going to do is we're going to say this is our list. So our list is currently empty. We are going to append to the end of this list, which just means we're just going to put it in the list because there's nothing already in there currently. We're going to append I into the list. Excuse me. So let's go ahead and execute that line. Now you can see this list has 1 in there. So now there is something in the list, okay? So as I executed that line, you can see, and I don't need to have a breakpoint here because it's never going to come back to this. It's just going to keep going back and forth to these and then down. But you can see that it's going to keep changing the value of I on each iteration of this line. Every time it executes this line, it's going to go ahead and add 1 to whatever the I value is. And then we already know what this line of code does. It takes the list, it adds whatever I is to the end of the list. So go ahead and do that. Boom, there it is. And then boom, there it is. Boom, there it is. And you just keep going on until you get to 10. Then when you get to 10, it will actually execute this last line of code. See, it just said, okay, we were at 11, so let's just skip. And now we're going to go ahead and print. And if we look at our console here, as I execute this line, boom, there it is. And then, of course, that's the end of the file. So it goes ahead and closes out the file and everything. But that's what's happening. I want you guys to be aware of this because debugging your code is probably the most important tool you will ever have in Python, and just as a programmer in general, if there are similar tools for other languages and other IDEs and stuff, just an extremely powerful thing to know is how do I debug my code and how do I see the values of my variables. And I promise you, I swear to God, if you can answer those 2 questions, you can answer almost any beginner programming question you've ever had in your life. What are the values of my variables? And what types are they? Because if you know what type of variable they are, maybe you're trying to use like a list method on a string. Like, what if this was a string and I was doing append and I was getting an error and I didn't understand what the error was? Like, I already told you that the append error can happen because you're doing, like, for example, if this is a string, I could say, for example, which I don't even have to do that. I could just say stuff dot append, and then Python's gonna yell at me. But like, maybe I'm getting this error and I don't know why I'm getting this error. I don't know what this means, and maybe I Google it, maybe I still don't understand. Well, if I take a look at this, if I execute this line, what's gonna happen is, like, maybe, well, this is kind of obvious, so we're just gonna say example string is equal to stuff, right? Because this is kind of obvious because you can see what it is, but it's still going to give me the same error, but I want to show you guys. Like, maybe I'm importing this value. Maybe I don't know that this is a string, right? So when I look at this, boom, look at this. Example string is equal to stuff. It's a string. You can see it right there, string value. And it shows it right here, in quotes, stuff. And I look at it, okay, it's a string, right? It's pretty obvious. Well, if I look at append, okay, append doesn't have... That's not a method of strings. You can add stuff onto strings, but you can't use the append method. That's a list method, right? And it'll show you, like, if I try to run this code, like, it'll say, like, it has no attribute, which means there's no method or attribute here that's called append. Like, that's not a thing for strings. Python is telling you that right now, attribute error, right? So We can fix that by just replacing it with the actual list that we want. Maybe I put the wrong variable name here. Maybe it's been a long day. Maybe it's a Friday night and you know, I've been here all week and it's been a long week and, I've got crazy stuff going on in my life. Maybe I just accidentally put the string value here and I didn't put the list value here. Who knows? Accidents happen. It's okay. Right? But that's what I want to show you is like it's important to catch this stuff. And this is how you catch this stuff is with debugging, right? So if you look at debugging here, now I can see it's doing what I want. Like if I look closely, I'm kind of going through it kind of quick, but if I look really closely at these values, it's saying, okay, I is equal to 3, add it to the list, boom, done. Now I is 4, okay, add it to the list, boom, done. Right? So that's like, it's really easy to see what your variable values are and what types they are from here. It even tells you, PyCharm is even nice enough to tell you what the length of the list is. It tells you what the list, tells you what the length of it is, like it's 4 items long. And this is a string, this is stuff, and it's a string. Like Python is really nice, like, and PyCharm itself. And VS Code also does this for you, by the way. If you're doing this in VS Code, it'll be like a similar window like this, but it'll be probably up here in the top left for you. And there's also a debug icon. It might not be the same looking icon, but there is a debug method like thing you can do in VS Code. I can promise you it does show up there too. And it's the thing about VS Code is it won't show you the values right here, but it'll at least show you in the little window like this, but up here, something like that. I think there might be a setting to do this. I don't know. Maybe it's like a, I know PyCharm does this, but I'm not sure about VS Code. But I do know that VS Code does have a debug function at all. It does have that feature. But anyway, that's kind of what I want to talk about, really. And let me quickly go over my notes real quick to make sure there wasn't anything I missed for you guys. And then I think that'll be it. I think that's all I wanted to cover after that. So let me check real fast, just in case. Just in case. Yeah, I think that was everything. I think that was everything I wanted to cover. Um, so if you want a visual representation of what classes look like real quick, I can show you that. But I'll just show that in another video because we're not quite at that point yet. But I will go over classes in more detail. I know we briefly talked about it, but we're not going to go too deep into classes right now. But that will help you understand these kinds of things. So anyway, I think I'm going to go ahead and end it there. But otherwise, if you have any questions, just feel free to ask me, and I will get back to you as quickly as I can on them, or if I can have the opportunity to. And other than that, yeah, just next week. I don't know what we're doing next week. If we have one next week, I can't remember what our topic was, but we'll get to it and I'll tell you. But anyway, otherwise, I hope you guys have a wonderful day and wonderful Christmas coming up and happy holidays and all that. And I'll see you guys later. Thanks.